was just tears at him. She's just a baby.
That was Tanner Horner's own mother explaining how she feels now knowing exactly what her son did. Last week, we covered the state's side of the trial in the Athena Strand case. Today, we're moving into the defense, calling their witnesses, bringing in psychologists, and hearing from Tanner Horner's loved ones, all in an effort to convince the jury to choose life without parole instead of the death penalty. But after that final day, honestly, of the state's evidence, it is hard to imagine many jurors aren't already leaning toward the harshest punishment possible. Over the course of last week, we heard from dozens of state witnesses, everyone from the medical examiner, investigators, and scientists to Athena's teacher and the people who loved her most. But there was one piece of evidence the public never heard, and honestly, that's for the best. The jury did, though, have to hear it. The audio captured inside the FedEx truck during Athena's murder. Reporters in the courtroom described jurors sobbing, some even glaring at Tanner. Before the state rested, the jury learned that 7-year-old Athena was abducted from outside her home on November 30th, 2022. The man responsible, Tanner Horner, was working as a contract delivery driver for FedEx and had just dropped off a package of Barbies, meant to be Athena's Christmas gift. Video from the truck showed him completing that delivery. Several minutes later, he was seen walking back toward the truck, with Athena following behind him. He lifted her into the van, placed her inside, and shut the door. Once inside, he told her, "Don't scream or I will hurt you." Athena, confused and starting to realize something was wrong, asked, "Where are you taking me?" At first, she didn't sound fully afraid, more confused than anything, but that changed. She stood up, and he forced her back down. Again, more urgently this time, she asked, "Where are you taking me?" Tanner got into the driver's seat and began to drive away, still not answering her. As the truck moved, he started asking questions. "How old are you? Do you have a sister? Where do you go to school?" Athena answered, "I'm 7. She gave her sister's name and said, "Her teacher is Ms. Thompson." He asked, "Is she nice?" Athena replied, "Yes." At one point, Athena said, "I have school tomorrow." He responded, "You have school tomorrow?" A short time later, he pulled over. Athena asked again, "Where are we going? What are you doing?" He replied, "We are going to hang out for a while." Around that point, Tanner covered the camera lens. The video cut out, but the audio kept recording. Inside the truck, the questioning continued, but then his tone changed. "You're really pretty," he said. "You know that?" The truck stopped again. Athena asked if they were at his house. He said no, and told her he lived far away. And then he gave her a command: "Take off your shirt." Athena immediately resisted. "Why? What are you doing?" Her voice changed, fear setting in. She started crying, asking over and over, "What are you doing? Are you a kidnapper?" "My mom said you can't do that. Can I go home? I want to go home. I want mama." Again, she asked, "Why are you doing this?" He answered, "Because you are pretty." Her distress escalated. She kept crying, pleading, "I want mama. Can I go home? I want to go home. Please stop." Then there were sounds that made it clear that she was being hurt. Choking, struggling. Prosecutors later say she fought back as Tanner made multiple attempts to kill her. After some time, the truck started moving again. Athena could still be heard screaming in the background. At one point, a Christmas song started playing on the radio. I won't say which one, because for the jury, that song is no longer tied to anything joyful. Through all of it, Tanner sang along as if nothing was happening while Athena continued to scream. He yelled at her, "Shut up. If you don't shut up, I'm going to hurt you worse." But her screams only got louder. Finally, he shouted, "Okay, you know what? I'm pulling over." And he did. There were several more loud bangs, more crying, and then sudden silence. That silence came a little over an hour after he first lifted her into the truck. After that, the only sounds were packages shifting around in the back. At some point later, Tanner could be heard coughing, possibly vomiting, before uncovering the camera. When the video resumed, he appeared calm, smoking a cigarette while driving. He eventually stopped at a gas station, went inside, and came back with paper towels and cleaning supplies. He went into the back of the truck and started scrubbing the floor. After leaving, he called his supervisor and asked if he could use the same truck again the next day, saying, "It kind of smells like barf in here. I guess I just ate something bad earlier." In the final portion of the footage, he was seen placing Athena's jeans and underwear into his backpack. These are the details that make this case so horrific, but also why it matters so much. This is the reality that Athena's parents, who we also heard from last week, have had to live with every single day. And telling her story, it does matter. Pushing for justice matters. Because even if for some reason Tanner isn't given the death penalty, the truth is out, the whole truth. And he won't get to quietly serve a life sentence without the world knowing what he did. So now, let's get to the defense. Wednesday, first up was psychologist John Edens, a professor at Texas A&M University. He's had a long career focused on forensic psychology and the study of violent risk. Edens walked through the jury through his background, an undergraduate degree from West Virginia State College, a master's in clinical psychology from Marshall University, and then a PhD from Texas A&M, where he still teaches today. After finishing his doctorate, he completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology at the University of South Florida. For about 20 years, Edens was licensed to practice psychology in Texas, but he eventually retired that license when he switched fully into academic work. His career has focused a lot on training doctoral students, conducting research, and studying the intersection of psychology and the legal system, especially when it comes to predicting violence. He's also the lead author of the Personality Assessment Inventory Interpretive Report for Correctional Settings, which he described as a tool designed to assess the psychological risks and needs of inmates entering prison. Next, Edens switched over into explaining the concepts behind his testimony. He described clinical psychology as the study of mental and emotional disturbances, problematic behavior, and how those conditions are assessed and treated. Within that field, his specialty is forensic psychology, applying those principles to people in the criminal justice system. A major focus of his research has been identifying risk factors for future violence and, importantly, how accurate or inaccurate those predictions tend to be. So when explaining personality disorders, Edens told the jury they are a long-standing set of problems related to personality traits that people have that can cause them conflicts with other people or cause them to experience distress. Unlike mood disorders, which can come and go, personality disorders are generally stable over time and are typically diagnosed in late adolescence or adulthood. But the heart of his testimony centered on one key issue: predicting future violence, particularly inside prison. So Edens made it clear that he did not evaluate Tanner personally, and he was not offering a specific opinion about Tanner's future. Instead, he was only going to speak generally about what the science says when it comes to risk. He said, "I have actually rarely offered a specific opinion about somebody's violent risk. My testimony has been historically been more about, are these risk factors relevant? And according to his research, many of the factors people assume are strong predictors really are not." For example, he testified that diagnoses like antisocial personality disorder are often used in court to argue someone is a future danger, but don't reliably predict violence in prison. In one study of about 350 inmates, that diagnosis did not correlate with misconduct or violent behavior at all. He also pointed to another study involving 155 capital murder cases, where experts had testified that the defendants would be dangerous in the future. Over roughly 10 years, 20% of those inmates had no disciplinary infractions at all. Only about 5% committed serious violence, and there were 0 murders. That finding tied into one of his biggest points. Truly serious violence in prison is rare. He explained that even in a massive system like Texas, with around 135,000 to 150,000 inmates, there are only about 20 homicides per year at most. So while prison is definitely stressful and can involve violence, it's not the hotbed of murder people might assume. And because of that, Edens said that when an event is rare, it becomes extremely hard to predict accurately. He explained that this often leads to false positives or situations where someone is labeled as dangerous but never actually commits violence. He also challenged another major assumption, that a person's crime itself will tell you how dangerous they will be in prison. He said, if you're trying to identify the people going into prison who are likely to be violent, then the crime that got them put into prison is not a great risk factor. Instead, research shows other factors are more relevant, like younger age, lower levels of education, gang affiliation, and prior violence in prison. He noted that people who enter prison at an older age or who have a GED or high school diploma are statistically less likely to engage in violence. At one point, he also clarified that violence inside prison often comes from individuals who weren't even convicted of violent crimes in the first place. So, okay, on cross-examination, prosecutors pushed back on that idea, focusing on the severity of Tanner's crime. The prosecutor said, you wouldn't disagree with me that the kidnapping and sexual assault of an individual would not be extreme, would you? Edens agreed and said, that's very extreme, the prosecutor went on. And then coupled with a murder on top of those together, that would make it even more extreme to you, correct? Edens said extreme in terms of the severity of what happened. Yes, absolutely. Prosecutors also challenged the implication of his testimony more directly, saying, so your testimony is basically somebody who is extremely violent walks through the prison doors and is now no longer violent? Edens responded, that's not my opinion. He clarified that he was not saying violent people suddenly become non-violent in prison, only that the details of the crime itself that put them there don't give you much useful information when trying to predict future behavior behind bars while in prison. He explained, I was not saying that if somebody who has a history of violence goes into prison, then that means that they won't be violent. They also highlighted that he was being paid for his testimony about $450 an hour, totaling roughly $6,000 to $7,000, and that he had testified mostly for defendants in the past. Another key point raised during cross was environment. Edens acknowledged that prison conditions matter a lot. Death row, for example, is far more restrictive than general population, and stress levels can influence behavior. The state asked, if someone reacts violently to stress, are they more likely to be violent? Edens responded, potentially, yes. Still, he maintained that no prediction is certain. He said there is always a risk of being wrong, both in overestimating and underestimating someone's potential for violence.
It kind of sounds like we don't really know. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we do know about the base rates from the prison system itself, about rates of serious violent behavior, inmate homicides, and generally rule infractions that people may engage in. And as I said before, there are increasing levels of rarity of those things. Some types of misconduct are quite common, and other forms, as you get more severe, become less common. But I do agree that in regards to a prediction about an individual people, there is always going to be the potential for that prediction to be wrong, either in the direction of claiming that somebody will be violent when they won't be in the future, or claiming that somebody won't be violent when in fact they will be.
So what it seems like you're saying is that it's based upon the individual inmate. Is that what you're talking about here?
No, I'm saying that a lot of the risk factors that you would look at in doing a structured assessment are characteristics of the inmate. But as I was saying, and as you pointed out, the circumstances in which somebody is housed, even within a prison setting, is going to have a significant impact on whether or not they are going to act out, have the opportunity to act out violently, or do act out violently. So it's really not just the characteristics of the individual, but those are things that are important to consider.
So let me just go through this here. In prison, and you've done a lot of studies on Texas prison system, is what I'm getting from you. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And in the Texas prison system, and I'm just going to talk about an inmate in the Texas prison system here. And their life in the Texas prison system, regardless of where they are, that life is not static, is it?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by static, but there are changes that can happen certainly while somebody is in prison, yes.
Fair enough, let me ask. There are many things in the prison system that the inmate does not control.
Yes.
The inmate does not control where they live.
Correct.
The inmate does not control who their roommate is.
Correct.
The inmate does not control what type of housing they get.
Correct.
Potentially, there are differences, things that change. Texas offers a dorm setting as well as more of the traditional cell setting, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And all of those things change.
Yes, things do change. The innovations, changes to programming, access, lots of things can change, yes.
Right. And you'll agree with me that prison in and of itself is a stressful environment. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes, I believe that is a very fair statement.
By the end of his testimony, Eden's central message was that predicting future violence, especially something as rare and as serious as prison violence, is extremely difficult. And many of the factors commonly relied on in court, including the nature of the crime itself, aren't as reliable as people might think. The defense's second witness was Tanner Horner's mother, Melissa Horner, who described a life filled with generational trauma. The camera was blurred during her testimony, and she explained that she was in a lot of pain after having 2 neck surgeries in the past year. Melissa told the jury that she was born and raised in Fort Worth, but her education ended early. She said she didn't make it far in school at all, only until about 9th grade. When asked why, she said, "I had a lot of issues in school and home." When they asked what she dreamed of becoming as a child, her answer was honestly pretty sad. She said, "I don't remember having dreams. I didn't have a good childhood." From there, the defense walked the jury straight into that childhood. I am really picky about skincare. I do not want a complicated routine. I want something easy, but something that actually works. And that is why I have been using OneSkin. What stood out to me is that it's rooted in real science. I love science, and their OS01 peptide is designed to target the underlying causes of skin aging, not just cover it up. And honestly, both Dr. John and I use it, and he loves it too, which I think says a lot. For me, it just makes my skin feel smoother, healthier, and it's easy to keep up with. It's born from over a decade of longevity research. OneSkin's OS01 peptide is proven to target the visible signs of aging, helping you unlock your healthiest skin now. And as you age, it will help. And for a limited time, try OneSkin with 15% off using code HIDDEN at oneskin.co/hidden. That's 15% off oneskin.co/hidden. Use code HIDDEN. And after you purchase, let them know we sent you. She described her mother as nurturing, but not very protective. And she explained that she was left alone at home as young as 6 years old. But the testimony took a much darker turn when she began talking about her first stepfather. According to Melissa, the abuse started when she was just 4 years old, before her mother even married him. She said, "When he tried to have sex with me, I was 4. Melissa told her mom, but her mom did not believe her. Melissa described how he covered her mouth with a rag soaked in something to make her pass out, and when her mother questioned him later, he explained it away. She said she believed him over me. Take a listen.
Even though you had told your mother that the man she was with at the time had abused you, did she break up with him?
No, she didn't believe me.
She didn't believe you?
I think he told her because he had put something on a rag to make me pass out, and she asked him what that smell was, and I think he said it perfume, or he spilled perfume on me and he had to clean it up or something. I don't know what he said. She believed him over me.
And even though he abused you, did they still get married?
Yes, ma'am.
After they married, did the abuse stop?
No, ma'am.
Was the abuse constant through the marriage, or was it at different times?
It was not constant. I think he felt lucky that I didn't die. And he quit for a while.
Despite that, her mother still married him, and the abuse continued. One haunting detail she shared was how, as a child, she would leave notes on her door. One said, "Whoever's coming in my room, please stop." The abuse didn't fully come to light until she was 14 and sent to rehab for marijuana use. Only then was her mother required to leave Melissa's abuser. From there, you can see the trajectory her life took. She dropped out of school, worked fast food jobs, and eventually began stripping at around 17 or 18. When asked how she felt about that, she gave a really telling answer. She said, "When you're abused at such a young age, it becomes a self-concept. This is what I'm here for." She added, "I wish I hadn't, but I did." To cope, she turned to alcohol first, Jack and Coke mostly, then meth, then eventually heroin. Melissa admitted that even getting through her job required substances. When asked if she needed drugs to go on stage, she said, "Yes, I've done everything." But heroin became her drug of choice, and not casually. She told the jury she's been using heroin for about 25 years. What stood out wasn't just the use, but how she explained it. When asked what heroin did for her, she said, "It makes me feel a lot better because I have a movie that plays in my head every day, and it gets rid of it." When they pressed her on what that movie was, she said, "It's my past. It's my abuse. It plays in my head every day." That's the defense, drawing a straight line from childhood trauma to lifelong addiction to an unstable environment. She then moved into her mental health struggles, diagnosed with bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, PTSD, and described hitting a breaking point. She said, "I was at my wit's end. I wanted to die." When asked why, she said, "I can't do nothing right."
Why did you go see doctors?
Because I was at my wit's end. I wanted to die.
Why did you want to die?
Because I can't do nothing right.
Ms. Horner, when you went to go see the doctors and they diagnosed you with bipolar and schizoaffective, were you also prescribed any medications?
Of course.
She admitted she didn't really stick with prescribed medication, saying she didn't give it a chance, which again adds to that picture of instability and untreated mental illness. She even said that she attempted suicide with heroin at one point. And from there, the testimony turned to Tanner's father, and the pattern continues in a way that's honestly hard to ignore. She met Tanner's father at the bar where she was working when she was 17 years old. He was 29. And the very first night, she said, he raped me, knocked me out, and did it all he wanted.
The first night we met, he raped me. There.
That night, did he ever hit you?
Yes, he did.
Tell me about that. What happened?
Well, he asked me to go back to his room and do a line, and I said, okay. And I went, and he was trying to fill me up. I said no, and he knocked me out and made me do what he wanted.
And yet, she stayed. She married him. When asked if it was love, she corrected that immediately. She said it wasn't love. But yeah, I married him. That line says a lot without needing explanation. It fits into everything she had already described, what she normalized, what she accepted, what she believed she deserved. Their relationship involved drugs, instability, and eventually separation. He later died in a motorcycle accident while Tanner was already in jail. And then the focus switched to Tanner before he was even born. And again, the defense is building context, right? Melissa admitted that when she became pregnant, she was still living that lifestyle, working in clubs, drinking heavily, and using drugs. She didn't even realize she was pregnant until about 8.5 weeks in. And during that time, she said, I was doing everything, anything I could get my hands on. She said she stopped drinking once she found out. She said, I wanted my baby to be healthy, but she continued smoking cigarettes and admitted to using marijuana occasionally to deal with severe nausea. Well, Tanner was born late, 3 weeks overdue, and the delivery was complicated. But when she held him, she said, it just changed everything. It wasn't just about me anymore. And for a moment, it sounds like maybe things could have stabilized, but they didn't. She admitted, I've never been able to stay sober. And when Tanner was just 2 years old, she relapsed. She went back into heroin. One of the most devastating moments in her testimony came when she described Tanner witnessing her addiction. She said she once used heroin in the bathroom, nodded off on the toilet, and little Tanner found her. She said, he thought I was dead. He told Mimi, Mom is dead. When asked how it made her feel, she said terrible. She admitted her drug use affected her ability to parent. Yes, there were several times. One year I was out of control. She lost jobs, was arrested for drugs and prostitution, and served time in prison. And when asked why she couldn't stay clean, her answer was blunt and self-aware. She said, I'm hard-headed. I don't take suggestions like I should. Despite all of that, she insisted she tried to be a mother in the way she could, making sure her kids had insurance, trying to provide when she was able. She said, I always wanted them to be taken care of because I never was. And then her testimony shifted to Tanner as a child. And this is where the defense started connecting all of that background directly to him. She described him as different socially, struggling to connect with other kids, not communicating the same way. She said it was sad to watch. He didn't know how to talk to them.
He didn't get along with, he wanted to get along with people, but they just weren't interested in having conversations with him. And having him around, it was sad to watch, very sad. They didn't like him at all.
How old was he when you first started to notice these things?
Probably when he started school.
Did any of this cause you any concern?
Oh, so sad to watch.
What types of things would you see? He wouldn't say things like they did. He didn't talk the way they did. And it isn't like I could hear what they're saying, but you can tell by looking at their faces, they're like, he didn't know how to talk to them the way. Did you see him having this trouble with other people? How did it make you feel when you saw your son having such difficulty interacting with children his own age?
I wanted to go get him help, see what's wrong.
She sought help, took him to be evaluated, and said he was diagnosed with Asperger's. She pushed back on other diagnoses like ADHD, saying medications would change him and make him something he wasn't. She described frequent meltdowns, especially when he couldn't communicate, and said they escalated beyond typical tantrums. He would punch himself in the head real hard. And an important point the defense made sure to highlight. His anger wasn't directed outward. She said it was at himself, really. He never tried to hit anybody. She also talked about bullying, saying it got worse over time and that she believed it contributed to his behavior. And then there's the home environment. For most of Tanner's life, they lived with her mother and second stepfather, Bill. She said Tanner kind of worshiped him, but also said Bill was mean to him. There were also moments of chaos, arguments turning physical, even one incident where Bill attacked her and Tanner intervened. I looked up and Tanner picked him up off of me. I was like, wow, I have somebody taking up for me. And that moment paints Tanner as protective. But again, the jury is hearing that alongside everything else. As Tanner got older, she described more normal aspects of his life: music, playing instruments, being in bands, video games, even wrestling and Little League, though she noted it didn't last long. Then we move into adulthood, his relationships with his fiancée Cassie and their child together. She said he was excited to become a father, but also scared. She described a time when he said, "I need you to take the baby for a little bit." She interpreted that fear as him being afraid of hurting the baby.
Who was the father of your grandson?
Tanner.
Were you around when Tanner learned that he was going to be a father?
Yes.
How did he react when he learned that he was going to be a dad?
He was very excited.
And were you around when your grandson was born?
Yeah, I was around.
How did Tanner react when his son was born?
He's just happy. I mean, everybody is, you know. Your babies are born.
Based on your observations of Tanner and his son, did he look like he enjoyed being a father?
He was a new father, you know. He'd never had a kid before, so he was scared. It scared him, you know. He was scared.
What do you mean by scared?
Like one day he goes, "Mom, please come I need you to take the baby for a little bit." He was scared, I think, of hurting the baby.
Did you watch Tanner and your grandson together often?
No, I didn't get to see him very much because all this happened.
Leading up to the crime, she said he was stressed, especially about finances and his relationship with Cassie. She talked about a conversation they had where Tanner said, "Mom, I don't know what to do. She's spending my money faster than I can make it." And then everything circled back to the case. When asked if she was angry with him for what he did to Athena, her response was emotional. She said, "I'm so mad at him. I want to just tear his ass up. She was just a baby." She was crying at this point. But when asked if she still loved him, she said, "Of course I love my son. I don't love who did that, though."
Are you angry with him?
I'm so mad at him. I want to just tear his ass up.
And
She's just a baby.
in spite of everything that you know about this case, do you still love your son?
Of course I love my son. I don't love who did that, though. I don't know who that was.
Okay, Miss Your Honor.
You okay? Do you need to take a few minutes?
I need to go to the bathroom just for a second.
That line is powerful and could be very intentional. It separates Tanner, the person, from Tanner, the criminal, which is exactly what the defense wants the jury to wrestle with. On cross-examination, the prosecution shifted the focus. They did not dispute her trauma, but they emphasized something else: stability. They walked her through the fact that despite her addiction, Tanner had a consistent home with Mimi and Papa, a place with rules, discipline, and structure. She agreed, saying yes, they were safe there. That's the state's counter-narrative. Yes, his upbringing was chaotic, but it wasn't only chaos. They also highlighted that Tanner had normal interests: music, sports, friendships, suggesting he was not completely isolated or incapable. And then they ended on a critical point: what she believes happened. At first, she said that she believed Tanner's version, that he backed into a little girl and panicked and strangled her. But after watching the trial, she broke down. She said, "I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say."
Well, at first I believed in what my son told me.
And what did he tell you?
That he had backed into a little girl, he panicked and strangled her.
And so you said at first I believed that, and now do you believe something different?
Yes, I do.
And have you been watching the live streams of the
Don't get me thrown in jail.
What was that?
Am I going to go to jail for that? No. Yes, I have.
Okay, you're not in trouble. I'm just asking if you had the ability to watch the trial.
Yes, I have.
Okay. So now that you've seen those things, what is your understanding about what happened?
I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say.
And then, after all of that, after laying her entire life bare in front of the jury, she reportedly said she needed to go to the hospital.
You don't have to keep excusing. I already need to go to the hospital, so can we finish?
We're done. We're done.
Okay, thank you.
So that testimony gave a lot of context into Tanner's life. It showed the trauma, the addiction, the mental health struggles, the instability, not just in his life, but going back generations. But the prosecution pointed out that it wasn't all chaos. There was structure at times. There were people taking care of him, and there were moments where Tanner was functioning like anyone else. We've been doing a spring refresh around here, and part of that was switching to Blissy pillowcases. The difference, it's real. Yeah, I honestly didn't think a pillowcase could make such a difference, but it just felt like one of those small changes that we wanted to make. And after switching to Blissy, I get why people talk about it. Fewer sleep creases. My skin feels hydrated. Silk is just so much gentler than cotton. It's cooling. It's breathable. It doesn't pull on your skin or hair while you sleep. Even Dr. John's noticed, which says a lot because he's not exactly out there reviewing pillowcases, but he is admittedly a fan too. And what makes Blissy different is the actual silk itself. It's 100% mulberry silk. So it's naturally cooling, breathable, really gentle on your skin and hair. Doesn't pull or tug, again, in the way cotton can. You're not dealing with frizz, breakage, irritation. Because you are a listener, Blissy is offering 60 nights risk-free, plus an additional 30% off when you shop at blissy.com/hidden. That's BLISSY.com/hidden. And then use code HIDDEN to get an additional 30% off. Your skin and hair will thank you. Next up, the defense called Tanner's great aunt Dottie. She explained that Tanner was her brother's grandson, which made her his great aunt. From there, the defense started building out the family tree, eventually landing on Tanner's father, Terry, Dottie's nephew. Dottie described Terry's childhood as anything but stable. His parents, Elmer and Janet, split up when one of the children was just 9 months old. And after that, everything kind of fell apart. The kids were split up between different relatives. One child went with her, another stayed with her grandmother. And Terry, he was the one who got moved around the most. He stayed with different family members and even spent some time in Ohio with his dad and stepmother, but nothing was ever permanent. So when the defense asked if Terry had a stable childhood, her answer was blunt. She said, not hardly. And when they asked why, she said, because he never really had a home. So again, another picture of instability from the start. She went on to explain that the instability didn't really get better as he got older. At one point, Terry was essentially homeless, even living in a storage building behind his sister's house. And then on top of that was drug use. Dottie said she knew he struggled with drugs and that it led to multiple prison sentences. It also affected her own relationship with him. She admitted she couldn't take him in because she didn't trust him due to the drugs. Before going to prison, Terry had multiple children. Dottie even said it was kind of a family joke because no one really knew how many, but Tanner was one of them. When Terry went to prison, Tanner was just a baby. And by that time he got out, Tanner was around 4 or 5 years old. And that's when Dottie started talking about something that clearly stood out to her, those weekend visits. So after Terry was released, he went to live with his mother, Ethel. Dottie said she was there almost every day, so she got to see these interactions up close. And according to her, Tanner came to visit his dad every single weekend. She said Terry was very happy to have him there. But those visits, they weren't exactly calm. Dottie described Tanner as being into everything, running around, getting into things, jumping on beds. At one point, she compared him to the Tasmanian devil, which gives you a pretty vivid image, but also sounds pretty typical for a little boy. She said he was jumping up and down on beds, getting into everything. I couldn't stand it. What's interesting is how the adults around him handled it. Dottie said her mother didn't want her correcting Tanner at all basically telling her to let it go because he was just there on the weekends. And when it came to discipline, it didn't sound like there was much consistency. When asked if anyone could control Tanner's behavior, she said, not really. She said Terry would try, he'd tell Tanner to stop, but it didn't always stick. Tanner might pause for a moment, but then he'd go right back to whatever he was doing. And her mother didn't step in either, at least not when Dottie was around. Dottie herself said Tanner would look at her and seemed a little intimidated, but she also made it clear she wasn't around enough to have much influence. So what we're seeing here is kind of this mix of a young child full of energy, a dad trying to reconnect after years away, a household that didn't really have structure or consistency. The visits continued every weekend while Terry lived there, except for one incident. Dottie testified that Tanner's mother kept him from visiting for about a week after an argument with Terry. And according to her, the argument was because Tanner's mom wanted Terry to go with her to buy drugs, and he refused. Despite everything, though, Dottie was very clear about one thing. She believed Terry loved his son. And when asked why she felt that way, she pointed to how he treated Tanner. She said he was patient, not harsh, and that he was genuinely wanted to be part of his son's life, especially after missing so much of it.
Based upon what you observed between Terry and Tanner, did Terry appear to love his son?
Oh, yes, yes. I know that he did. He really did.
What makes you say that?
Because of the way he acted with him. You know, when I said something about him jumping up and down on the bed, the way Terry got him to stop, you know, instead of, you know, I would have swatted him, but not Terry, not with the, you know, he really cared and knew that he'd been gone out of his life and he wanted to be back in his life. I really think he was just a very small baby when he went to prison.
And based on your observations and your interactions with Terry and Tanner, do you feel that Terry was trying to turn his life around to take care of his son?
Yes, I do.
Was he able to do that?
No, he wasn't.
The defense also asked whether she believed Terry was trying to turn things around and take better care of him. Dottie said she thought he was, but ultimately he was not successful. By the end of her testimony, Dottie became emotional on the stand and needed a moment. And after that, the prosecution did not ask her a single question on cross-exam. So her testimony, in other words, it stood as is. A picture of a chaotic family background, a father who grew up without stability, struggled with drugs in prison, but still, in her view, loved his son and tried, at least in some way, to reconnect and do better. And after that, court ended for the day. And now moving into day 2 of the defense's case Thursday. The first witness they called was Tanner's aunt. She was blurred on the live stream, and this testimony seemed to be less about Tanner himself and more about the family he came from. You guys know Lily Bell is basically the head of HR here at Hidden True Crime. She's always right there with us, whether we're working late, recording, or just trying to decompress after covering really heavy cases. She is a huge part of our family. And honestly, we would do anything for her. And if you have ever owned a pet, you know they kind of run on their own logic. Jump first, think later, which is exactly how you end up with those moments where something happens and you're thinking, do we need the vet right now? A quick message from today's sponsor, the ASPCA Pet Health Insurance Program. Pet insurance can help take the financial question out of those moments so you can focus on getting your pet the care they need instead of worrying about the cost. And I'll say, having pet insurance for Lily Bell has been such a lifesaver over the years when she's been sick or had injuries. When you enroll in an ASPCA pet health insurance plan, you could also get a $25 Amazon gift card, which is a nice little bonus. And the program offers customizable accident and illness plans, so you can find something that fits your pet and your budget. To explore coverage and options, visit aspcapetinsurance.com/hidden. That's aspcapetinsurance.com/hidden. Eligibility restrictions apply. Visit aspcapetinsurance.com/Amazon terms for more info. This is a paid advertisement. Insurance is underwritten by either Independent American Insurance Company or United States Fire Insurance Company and produced by PTZ Insurance Agency Limited. The ASPCA is not an insurer and is not engaged in the business of insurance. She explained that Tanner is her brother Terry's son, but her relationship with him is pretty minimal. She said she had only seen Tanner probably 3 times in his life, if not 4. One time as a baby, once when he was around 5 or 6, and then one very brief interaction as an adult where she said, I wouldn't have recognized him if I saw him on the street. So important context going on, right? She wasn't someone who really knew Tanner on a personal level at all. Instead, the bulk of her testimony focused on her brother Terry, Tanner's father, and her description of Terry was intense. She told the jury flat out, Terry left home at 13 and he started doing drugs at that time. She said he spent about 90% of his adult life in prison and then added something much more serious. She said, he molested me when I was younger. He threatened to kill me 3 different times, and he was not a very nice person. She did not hold back at all. She also said he beat their mother and stole from her, and that this behavior wasn't out of the ordinary for him. According to her, he stole from both of my sisters, and even when people tried to help him, he would turn around and betray them. She gave an example where a relative gave Terry a job, and she said he repaid that kindness by breaking in that same night and stealing all of the money and weapons that were in the building. So the picture she painted of Terry was someone deeply involved in drugs, crime, and violence for most of his life. And then she got into how he lived as an adult, and the details were pretty disturbing. At one point, their mother let him stay on her property in an Airstream trailer because they thought he had finally straightened his life out. But according to her, that didn't last. She described the conditions as horrible, saying when Terry and other drug users would get high, they would pick stuff apart like coffee makers and microwaves and couldn't put it back together. After their mother passed, she had to clean up the property and said there was junk everywhere. She even found 5-gallon buckets of poop because he wouldn't come inside to use the bathroom.
And when you saw it, what were his living conditions like?
It was horrible. He had, a lot of drug users, especially Terry, whenever they would get high, they would take stuff apart like coffee makers and microwaves and whatever else they could and couldn't put it back together. When Mom passed, I hired someone to clean up the backyard because he had left it. Stuff was everywhere. And they found buckets, 5-gallon buckets of poop because Terry wouldn't come in the house to use the bathroom.
Now, I know what an Airstream is, but can you tell?
Oh, I'm sorry. Airstream RV is a bumper pull trailer.
And did Terry ever, as an adult, live on your sister's property?
Yes, he lived on my oldest sister's property, and he lived in the garage, and then eventually he got a small bumper pull, and it was a gorgeous house, but in the backyard there was so much stuff. Air conditioner parts, cars, boats, you name it, it was back there. He would just bring stuff home.
Now, what did your brother do for a living?
Steel. He could weld, but, sorry, I'm bluntly honest here. He could weld, a darn good welder, but because he was into drugs, he couldn't keep a job, so he would just steal whatever.
And it wasn't just this one place. She said whenever Terry lived somewhere, the same pattern followed. Trash, broken items, piles of random junk, just chaos. From there, her testimony switched to the broader family dynamic. And again, it was rough. She told the jury their mother was emotionally and verbally abusive to all of them. She said if the 4 of us were getting along, she had to pit one against the other, which created constant tension and drama in the house. Eventually, she said after her mother passed away, she cut ties with the entire family. She also talked about mental health and substance abuse running through the family. She said her mother was bipolar, had severe anxiety and depression, and that mixing alcohol with prescription medication was not really a good thing. She also mentioned other relatives struggling with drugs, making it clear she wasn't just one person. It was again and again and again a pattern. Then the defense brought it back to Tanner's parents. She said she had only seen Melissa and Terry together maybe 5 times, but when she did, they were always stoned. She described their home as horrible. There was trash everywhere, which lines up with, again, that pattern she had already described with Terry. As for Tanner himself, she didn't have a lot to add, but she did tell the jury that as a child, Tanner cried a lot, like nothing would soothe him. She described him as very sensitive, almost to an extreme. She gave an example of lightly disciplining him after he ran toward the street and said his reaction was so intense that you would have thought that I beat the tar out of him. He cried, hiccuped, and kept saying, "She made me cry."
Did you ever babysit Tanner?
I did twice.
Okay, and do you remember about what age that was?
He was a baby the first time, and he was about 5, maybe 6 the second time.
Can you describe what he was like at those ages?
He cried a lot. It was like nothing you could do could stop. You could change his diaper, you could hold him, you could put him to sleep. At 5, it was like he wore his heart on his sleeve, and saying that you could go, "Don't do that," and he would just cry. And he went to run out to the street, and I grabbed him and I swatted him on his butt like that, and you would have thought I beat the tar out of him. He was crying and hiccuping, and we were at my ex-mother-in-law, and he looked at her and he said, "She made me cry." And he just kept crying. I didn't know what to do with him because my children weren't like that. And I felt bad because I couldn't get him to stop crying.
She also said he wasn't very talkative, but again, that's pretty much the extent of her firsthand knowledge about him. She did mention that as an adult, Tanner had a camper on her mother's property and that her mom wanted it gone. She ended up having it hauled off after it sat there longer than it was supposed to. And now when the prosecution got up to cross, they did not spend a lot of time with her at all, but they made a very specific point. They highlighted that while she gave a lot of testimony about Terry and the family's history, her actual knowledge of Tanner came down to those few brief interactions, 3 or 4 times total. That's it. They also clarified something important. Even though she accused Terry of abuse, he had not actually gone to prison for any sexual offenses. And then they ended on kind of a contrast moment. They pointed out that despite everything she described growing up, she herself does not use drugs, is not a felon, and has not committed violent crimes. There was no redirect from the defense after that, and she was excused. So I've actually seen a lot of comments in the live stream chat saying things like, these witnesses aren't helping the defense. They aren't helping Tanner. But I think that's kind of the point. They're trying to paint a picture of the environment Tanner came from, right? Generational trauma, substance abuse, instability, all of it. Whether that resonates with the jury or not is a different question, especially since this witness barely knew Tanner himself. But what the defense is trying to do essentially is humanize Tanner. Could there be one juror that finds empathy for him because they had a rough upbringing and maybe they believe Tanner didn't have a chance? I don't know. But as a starting point for 2 days, the defense clearly wants to set that tone. The next witness the defense called was a woman identified as Miss Sullivan, who is Tanner's second cousin. So like the previous witness, her face was blurred on the live stream. She started by explaining the family connection, saying, "My father's sister Jackie is my aunt, and then his mother is my cousin, and Tanner would be her son." So again, we're seeing another extended family member, not someone who is in Tanner's day-to-day life long-term, but someone who had contact with him when he was very young. And almost immediately, her testimony turned emotional. She talked about Tanner's mother. And you could hear the sort of like switch in her voice, right? She said Tanner's mom used to be full of life and then very different from the way she is today. I don't recognize her. That stood out because, again, this pattern adds to the pattern the defense is building, showing a decline over time, especially tied to drugs and instability.
My cousin, she was awesome. I looked up to her a lot. She was full of life then. She was a different person back then. I met my best friend because of her. She just was full of life then, that's all I can say. She was a happy person then.
Very different from the way she is today?
I don't recognize her.
How was Melissa as a babysitter?
She was fun, exciting, loved it when she came over. She was probably one of my favorite babysitters, and we had a lot. She kept us busy. There was me and my 3 brothers, so she had her hands full. She liked to play Fly to the Moon, where she'd kick us off her feet. She would take us to the park. She'd walk us around the neighborhood. She just had so much energy.
She explained that when she was just a child herself, around 10 years old, she would babysit Tanner when he was an infant. And this part is honestly, so this part is striking to me. She said Tanner's mom would leave her alone with the baby, even at that age, and that she would sometimes pay her not just with money, but with marijuana. When asked directly if she thought Tanner's mom was a good mother, she didn't go all the way in one direction or the other. She said she was struggling. She did her best. She tried. So it wasn't outright condemnation, but it definitely acknowledged that things were not stable.
And we talked about her providing for you while you were babysitting her son. Based upon your observations of Ms. Horner and Tanner, do you think she was a good mom?
At the time, you mean?
We'll start at the time.
Yes, at the time, yes.
And looking back now?
She was struggling. She did her best. She tried. Yeah.
Like the desire was there, but the ability not?
Yeah.
Then she started describing Tanner as a child, and some of this was pretty unusual. She said he had a lot of energy, describing it as spurts of energy, and then mentioned that Tanner would eat coins and loose change. She said it was almost like an obsession. If there was change around, coins around, it was inevitable. That's not typical childhood behavior, and it seemed like the defense was trying to highlight early signs that something might have been really different with him developmentally or behaviorally. She also described him as having real high highs and real low lows, which again points toward emotional, possible behavioral issues. She said sometimes he would get so hyper that it would almost be aggressive. She was asked directly if Tanner ever hit her, and her answer was pretty measured. She said there may have been an occasion, but it was usually with fit throwing. Like it wasn't like he was intentionally hitting her like a tantrum or something. So she didn't characterize him as violent in sort of a deliberate way, more like a kid having outbursts. She also said Tanner tended to play by himself and seemed content being alone, which could be interpreted a lot of different ways. And then on a cross-examination, the prosecution once again did something very similar to what they did with the aunt. They clarified that Sullivan had not seen Tanner since 1993. So again, we're talking about observations from very early childhood, not anything recent. And then they asked those same blunt, almost they're jarring questions. They've been using these with the witnesses, whether she had ever killed anyone, kidnapped anyone, or assaulted a child. And she answered no to all of them. So just like the aunt's testimony, this really wasn't about Tanner as an adult. It was about building a picture of his early life, exposure to drugs at an early age, being left with questionable people in questionable situations, and showing behaviors that the defense clearly wants the jury to see as red flags from the beginning. But at the same time, the prosecution keeps hammering that same point again and again and again. None of these witnesses actually knew Tanner in any meaningful, recent way. Everything we're hearing is from when he was a small child. And even though this whole family came from the same environment, Tanner is the only one who kidnapped and murdered a little girl. So after hearing from family members, the defense switched gears and brought in an expert witness, Dr. Aaron Spech. He's an assistant professor at Purdue University, and his whole area of expertise is environmental health and exposure assessment. He explained to the jury that his work focuses on detecting environmental contaminants and studying how those contaminants affect the human body over time. He even mentioned that he had previously testified in connection with the Flint, Michigan water crisis, and pretty quickly it became clear where this was going. This was all about lead exposure. Dr. Spech, he started by explaining how lead is measured in the body. He said you can look at it in blood or in bone, but those tell you very different things. Blood lead levels only show recent exposure because lead in the blood has about a half-life of about 30 days. But bone is where lead sticks around long-term, with a half-life of about 30 years. So when you measure lead in bone, you're not just seeing what someone was exposed to recently, you're seeing a cumulative picture of exposure over their entire life. So this matters allegedly because lead doesn't come and go. It crosses into the brain, it causes damage that, according to him, is permanent. He told the jury that even if blood levels go down over time, those effects are going to linger. They're going to stay there for the rest of your life. So again, implication here, long-term neurological impact. He then talked about technology. He uses something called a portable XRF machine, which can scan a person's shin and measure how much lead is stored in their bones. So he actually tested Tanner. Before even doing that, he said he had already seen some records suggesting possible lead exposure, including potential exposure to lead paint. And then he referenced something the jury had already heard earlier that day, saying, I heard the testimony this morning about him eating coins. That's problematic for lead exposure. So again, this is all tying together. Now we get it. The earlier witness talking about Tanner eating coins as a child, and now the expert is saying the behavior could actually contribute to lead exposure. Then he gave the results. He told the jury that Tanner had a bone lead level of 12.1 micrograms per gram. To put that into perspective, he said that's about 24 times higher than what you would expect in a comparison group. So still need more help there. So luckily he broke it down even further, saying when they calculated total body lead, Tanner came back with about 33,000 micrograms compared to his peers who were closer to around 1,500. So in his words, this wasn't just elevated, this was extreme lead levels. He said, my opinion is that Mr. Horner experienced a significant amount of lead exposure that would have impacted his health and particularly his neurological health. And at one point, he described the level of exposure as pretty massive. So now, when the prosecution got up to cross-examine him, they didn't really challenge like the numbers of lead exposure at first. Instead, they focus on what those numbers actually mean in like basic practical terms. They pointed out that if the expected level is around 0.5 micrograms and Tanner's was 12.1, that's where the 24 times higher figure comes from. So Dr. Spech agreed with that. But then they asked the question that probably a lot of jurors were already thinking, basically, so if the exposure was that high, how is he still functioning? Right? I'm wondering. So one of the prosecutors asked, so at that level, how is it that Mr. Horner is still walking around? Even more bluntly, how is he still alive? And the doctor's answer was interesting because he didn't back off his opinion. He said, I'm not claiming that he doesn't have any effect from it. He does have an effect from it. But he explained that lead toxicity doesn't work in a simple all or nothing way. It depends on the dose and how quickly that exposure happens. He said when exposure happens over time, the body accumulates it and it causes damage, especially to the brain, but it's not necessarily immediately fatal. The lethality depends on how fast and how much exposure happens at once.
It doesn't seem like very much, but again, this is something, we ingest a lot of it and maybe a lot of it's going to pass through our body, but this is stuff that's actually been incorporated into our body. And so it doesn't take all that much to cause harm. And in terms of the toxicology of this, we know, so this was actually just the bone content. But the bone content, you're not super worried about the bone content. In toxicological studies, we have shown that the bone is a good corollary for what is actually in the brain as well. So we can use this as a determining factor. Okay, well then his brain was exposed to this amount over some amount of time as well. And that's more impactful.
Right, I'm just trying to figure this out. I'm trying to figure out how much is it. I mean, 0.03 grams, is that like a BB? Is that what we're talking about? That's the total amount?
It could be on the same order, yeah.
Okay, so something, we're talking in the entirety of his whole body, something like this.
Yes, but it's actually incorporated into his body. And again, it's 24 times higher than what any one of his peer groups would have been exposed to.
So basically, his position was that Tanner's levels were very high, high enough to cause lasting neurological harm, but not necessarily high enough in the way it occurred to kill him. So, okay, lead poisoning. There you go. The next witness the defense called was a former therapist named Mr. Weeks, and his testimony came in by video. So he had worked at a place called First Choice back in 1999, which he described as a residential treatment facility in Fort Worth that focused on families dealing with drug and alcohol addiction. And this is important because why? Well, it ties directly into Tanner's childhood and the environment he was in at a really young age. Surprise. Mr. Weeks explained that First Choice wasn't just for individuals. Families actually lived there together. He said it was mostly women who were primary clients and they would bring their children with them. So this wasn't like outpatient therapy. These were people fully living at the facility while getting treatment. He also said that most of his clients had what's called a dual diagnosis, meaning they weren't just dealing with substance abuse, but also mental health issues like depression or anxiety. So then at one point, he said it would be shocking if someone there didn't also have a mental health issue. And when it came to trauma, he said that it was almost always present in people struggling with addiction. Mr. Weeks talked about how treatment worked at the facility. And when someone came in, they would go through an intake process where staff gathered to really kind of go over the details and their background, things like drug history, legal issues, medical conditions, education, finances, basically everything you'd need to understand why that person was there and what you were dealing with. So you could kind of build a treatment plan around it, right? So his role specifically was as a therapist, and he said he worked mostly with the children. So one of the main methods he used was play therapy, which he explained as using toys, creative activities to help kids express things they might not be able to put into words. Okay, I'm interested at this point. I'm listening here. So instead of sitting down and talking through emotions like an adult would, kids could kind of act things out or show what they were feeling in a different way. Then the defense brought it back to Tanner and his mom. Mr. Weeks said he did remember them being at the facility, but the way he remembered them is important. He said at first it was just sort of a vague recognition of the name. It wasn't until he was shown a photo that it really clicked. And he said, I recognized the mother immediately. But when it came to Tanner, he admitted, I didn't recognize him at all. He estimated Tanner would have been maybe around 6 or 8 years old at the time, but even then, his memory was pretty general. When asked about his impressions of them as a family, he said there was nothing unique about them. He described their situation as similar to other families there. A mother struggling with substance abuse, a child affected by it. That was kind of the baseline at the facility. Then, when they got into his work with Tanner, things got even less certain. He said he assumed he had worked with him because that was his role at the time. But he was very upfront that he didn't have any records anymore and couldn't say for sure. He also could not recall any specific behaviors from Tanner. No clear memories of acting out or temper tantrums, even though he did say that kind of behavior would have been common in that environment. That's it. Yeah. I thought we were going to hear some interesting things about Tanner, but that was it. On cross-examination, the prosecution basically summed it up and asked him directly if it was fair to say he didn't have any real specific recollection of Tanner or his mother beyond general memories at the facility. And he agreed. He said he has some basic memories of the services they provided at First Choice, but no specific memories about the family. Okay, so thinking about this, it was actually a really interesting witness for the defense. On one hand, He kind of helped reinforce the overall theme of a childhood surrounded by addiction, trauma, and instability because they were at this facility, right? But on the other hand, when it came to Tanner specifically, his testimony didn't add in much at all, no details. He couldn't even say what Tanner was like. Tanner wasn't even memorable. He didn't know how he behaved. He didn't know what kind of treatment he received. So I'm not really sure how much the jury really cares about witnesses like this. The next witness the defense called was referred to only as Mary. Okay, so who's Mary? Well, Mary is a former licensed specialist in school psychology who had worked with Tanner when he was in school, and she testified about her background first, explaining that she has spent about 35 years in school psychology before retiring. She walked the jury through her education and career starting in the late 1970s and working across multiple school districts, and where she eventually evaluated Tanner. So right away, there was a bit of tension about her role. The court made it clear she was not there as an expert witness, but rather to talk about her direct experiences and what she personally did when working with Tanner. Still, a lot of what she said naturally came from her years of experience. So there were a few objections along the way when things started to sound more like expert opinions. And I agree, it was complicated for me to kind of hear that someone that's an expert in her field would not be an expert witness. But when it came to Tanner specifically, Mary explained that she performed a 3-year reevaluation on him while he was a student. That's something schools routinely do for students receiving special education services to see where they are, right? Whether their needs have changed. How are they doing? She described the evaluation process as though pretty involved. So it's not like it's like a quick meeting or checking them out, saying, how are you doing? It includes reviewing past records, talking to teachers, interviewing family members, observing the student in different settings like classrooms, lunchrooms, even recess. The goal is to sort of get this really vast picture of how the student functioned, especially though, and particularly how they functioned socially. She also mentioned that she spoke with Tanner's grandmother during this process a lot and remembered that she seemed concerned about him. Interestingly, though, she said she never met his mother and wasn't aware of any consistent male role model in his life. So from what she saw in the records and during her evaluation, Tanner had already been identified as being on the autism spectrum, and her findings supported that. Nothing in her evaluation led her to believe anything different. She explained that Tanner was placed in what was called a behavior improvement class, or BIC, for part of that day. That's a more structured classroom setting with fewer students, but more support. But he wasn't isolated there completely. He also spent part of his day in general education classes. She said that Tanner was intellectually capable. He was bright, as she put it. So the goal was to let him succeed in regular classes while still giving him the behavioral support he needed in a more controlled environment. She also noted that he received additional services, including speech and language support, and something called in-home training. That meant a therapist would actually work with him outside of school, helping him navigate real-world social situations. So when she got into the details of her findings, that's where things became a little bit more telling. She said Tanner had difficulty getting along with others, and that stood out as a consistent, ongoing issue. He did not struggle with language in the traditional sense. He could talk, he could communicate, but he had trouble with what's called social or pragmatic language, basically understanding tone, understanding context, and the deeper meaning behind what people say. She explained that while he could understand words, he could not always understand what people meant by the words. She also talked about empathy, and this part was pretty significant because I think we've all been wondering about Tanner Horner's empathy. She said that Tanner showed a lack of empathy, meaning he had difficulty understanding how his actions affected other people or recognizing what someone else might be feeling. Not in a malicious way necessarily, but more in a disconnected, limited way. Take a listen.
You had, in your report, you state that Tanner lacks empathy and has little ability to form friendships. What did you mean by that?
Well, based on my memory, he did have difficulty getting along with others. But again, I can't explain why. There are many reasons for behavior. Probably I shouldn't say more about
Is that uncommon with someone
it.
with autism?
It's not uncommon, and I guess I would say it's common, and it's not so much that all people with autism don't get along with others, because some do. Sometimes it's more limited with others, sometimes it looks a little bit different. It's just, there's a difference.
When we talk about empathy, what does that mean?
Empathy is the ability to feel something else that someone else is going through, to understand it through their eyes.
Is there a difference between empathy and sympathy?
I believe there is a difference, yes. Sympathy is feeling sorry for, or empathy is feeling those feelings within yourself and understanding them on a more comprehensive level.
So when you say that someone lacks empathy, what does that look like?
In this circumstance, for Tanner and for many students on the spectrum with social deficits in this area, it would just mean it was more limited. He or she would not stop to think about how his behavior might be affecting them, or he or she may not stop and understand that the way maybe his look or his lack of a look made a person feel or do something else. Again, that connection between the way we behave or our mannerisms affect others. I don't think I answered. I'm not really sure. Let's try it again.
I thought that was a perfect answer.
She clarified that this doesn't mean someone feels nothing. It means that ability is reduced or not as intuitive. Still, hearing that in a courtroom, especially in a case like this, definitely makes you think and maybe confirms some of the things I thought. Another issue she pointed out was his difficulty forming friendships. He struggled socially with peers and tended to have more success interacting with adults, although even that could involve some argumentativeness at times. She also described him as being rigid with change, which is something commonly seen in individuals on the spectrum. Transitions could be hard for him. So moving from one activity to another, especially if he wasn't ready, that could cause resistance from Tanner. There was also possible sensory issues. She remembered concerns from his grandmother about hygiene, like not wanting to shower or use deodorant. She said that could be tied to sensory sensitivities, although she also acknowledged that some of that can be typical for boys at that age. Importantly, she said she never personally saw Tanner become aggressive. That stood out, especially because later on, the prosecution brought up that there were reports in his history about anger issues and possibly aggression. But from her own direct experience, she said, I did not ever see that. She did note, though, that there were goals in his records about reducing temper tantrums and possibly mentions of aggression, but nothing clearly defined. And when it came to his diagnosis, she described it at the time as sort of like this mild form of Asperger's, which today would fall under level 1 autism. Asperger's is no longer a thing. Level 1 autism. That basically means lower support needs, someone who can function in many everyday situations, but still has noticeable challenges, especially socially. But then she made an important point that even mild autism is still autism. As far as recommendations back then, she said Tanner should continue with the services he was already receiving because they seemed to be helping. She also recommended ongoing social skills training and suggested a psychological evaluation, as well as care from a psychiatrist for possible medication management. Well, looking back, she said she believed he had a very good treatment plan at the time. One thing she mentioned that stood out was that Tanner didn't really come across as one of the more severe or high-need students in the district. She said in her role, she would usually hear more about the students who were really struggling, and Tanner was not one of the ones constantly being flagged. So now, on cross-examination, the prosecution tried to narrow things down and highlight the limits of her testimony. They pointed out that while she provided all this background, there were documented concerns about anger and behavior in his history. They also pushed on the idea of how much support he actually needed and whether his condition was as impairing as the defense was suggesting. And with that, after her testimony and cross-examination wrapped up, trial ended for the day. And then Friday, day 3 of the defense. When court picked back up on Friday, the defense called their first witness of the day, one of Tanner's former 5th grade teachers. She told the jury that Tanner had been diagnosed with autism during the time that he was in her class. And as she started describing him, you could tell she was trying to be honest, but also compassionate. She explained that he struggled socially and that part of that may have been because he joined her class in the middle of the school year. And that alone, that can throw any kid off. But in Tanner's case, she said he also had trouble understanding social norms. When she was asked whether she knew if he had friends, she said, "I do not," and then clarified that she did not remember him really forming friendships during that time. She went on to explain how other students perceived him. She said they thought he was odd. And she gave examples that made that label make sense in a classroom setting. Things like Tanner announcing to the entire class that he needed to go to the bathroom, something most 5th graders had already learned to handle a lot more quietly. They learned that after 1st grade. She said he would blurt things out like that and could come across as sort of standoffish at times. But what really sort of added depth to her testimony was how much effort that she put into trying to create an environment where kids like Tanner could succeed. This is like a really good teacher. She described these structured sort of morning meetings that she held every single day. And the students would start by practicing eye contact and greeting each other, then move into a one-word emotional check-in. Simple things like happy, tired, good, bad. And if they wanted, they could expand on it. The idea was to help students understand each other and recognize when someone might need space. She explained that these routines were meant to build social awareness and connection. And while she could not say definitively how much it helped Tanner specifically, she believed in those methods. It gave the impression that Tanner wasn't just left to struggle. There were attempts to reach him, to include him, to guide him. And then came some of the more personal stories. She talked about a class party, likely Valentine's Day, and how Tanner really, really, really wanted the class to do Mad Libs. It was something he loved, but the rest of the class wasn't interested. So she told him they'd be doing something else. She told him he could go ahead and do the Mad Libs on his own if he wanted, and he did. She described how he sat there filling it out by himself, laughing and clearly enjoying it, but also kind of like performing it in a way, like he was hoping the other kids would notice and maybe want to join in. She said you could tell he was trying to sell it, which is such a specific, it's like a very specific kind of telling observation. And she added that doing Mad Libs alone isn't really funny, right? If you know, you know, because you already know the words going in, but he was still laughing, trying to make it seem fun, sort of paints kind of a picture of a kid who wanted connection, even if he didn't quite know how to get it. Another moment she shared was almost unintentionally funny, but still revealing. One day, Tanner came into class wearing a winter hat. And when he took it off, she noticed what looked like dried bubbles in his hair. So she asked him gently, "Tanner, honey, do you still have shampoo in your hair?" And he checked and realized, yes, he did. His response was like, "Oh my gosh, I forgot to wash it out." So she sent him to the nurse to rinse it. But again, sort of like one of those small things that reinforces the idea that he sometimes missed details other kids wouldn't. She also recalled a moment involving their bathroom routine, which the class handled in an organized way, small groups at a time, while others waited in the hallway playing games. And after one trip to the library, Tanner handed her his books and said, "Can you take these back for me? Because I'm going to be in there for a while." And she said it made her laugh along with the rest of the class. It was this funny moment, but it also shows how he interacted, like very literal, open, like not always filtering what he said. Throughout all of this, she made it clear that Tanner wasn't disruptive in an aggressive or alarming way, When asked if he got angry or had major behavioral issues, she said nothing stood out. She believed that she was able to keep him calm and motivated, and she even said she thought he enjoyed being in her class. I want to say I'm impressed that she remembers so much, so many years ago. This is a good teacher. When she was asked about her relationship with Tanner, she said, "I enjoyed being his teacher." And as she continued, she became visibly emotional, tearing up as she told the jury that she hopes all of her students know that she loves them.
I enjoyed. I enjoy being a teacher.
Sounds like you put a lot of thought into it. Were you able to try to talk to the other teachers and try to tell them about your relationship with her and what had worked well for you?
I called them.
Do you think Tanner knew you loved him?
I hope all of my kids know that I love them.
Can you imagine being a teacher who loves her students so much, loves children so much, has dedicated your life to loving students, even the ones who are odd, remembering them in such detail, and then learning that one of those students that you love so much, that you work so hard to make sure that your classroom was a safe place for them, does something that is unthinkable to another child years later. It's just such a moment to think about. God bless good teachers. God bless this teacher. But I cannot imagine how she feels. She also mentioned that when Tanner left her class and transferred schools, his new school reached out fairly quickly, asking what strategies she had used with him. And then the prosecution stepped in for cross-examination. They pointed out that Tanner was only in her class for a short period, just a few months in the middle of the year. They emphasized that it's not unusual for students who transfer mid-year to struggle socially. And importantly, they highlighted that despite everything she described, Tanner was still able to participate. He joined the morning meetings. He communicated during these one-word check-ins that she had where they talked about their emotions. He interacted with other students. He wasn't isolated to the point of not being able to function. So again, the defense is laying the groundwork to show developmental and social challenges, while the prosecution is reinforcing that he was still capable, still engaging, he was aware, he was participating, he had a community, he had teachers, he had efforts, he had services. That's what the prosecution is pointing out. But next, the defense called a speech-language pathologist. She has to only be identified as Beth and not be shown. She began walking the jury through her background. She had a master's in speech therapy and worked as both a speech-language pathologist and what's called an in-home facilitator. Her role was much more hands-on and immersive. She explained that she worked with kids who had cognitive deficits, speech issues, swallowing disorders, stuttering, and language delays. The kids who sometimes struggled to even understand what was being asked of them in a general classroom setting. She also worked with students with neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism. Her job as an in-home facilitator was especially important. So she described it as working, so like not just with the student, but sort of like the environment as a whole, the entire environment. So coordinating with teachers, going into their homes, helping parents, and building structured behavioral plans. The goal was consistency. As she explained, if what's happening at school doesn't match what's happening at home, the whole system starts to break down. She even said when that happens, it's like riding a bicycle with one tire. You're not going to get very far. She told the jury that Tanner had qualified for this program after going through the proper diagnostics, and she worked with him when he was around 7th grade. And when the defense asked her about his social abilities, her answer was, again, very blunt, not good. She explained that his cognitive abilities seemed to hit a ceiling, especially when it came to understanding more complex social interactions, things like jokes, teasing, sarcasm, things sort of that don't land the way they would for other kids. Instead, they often confused him or upset him. She said he was bullied in school and that it would aggravate him and it would make him angry. And when asked whether he could recognize other people's emotions. She said, at times, so not really a confident answer, right? At times. Boundaries were another major issue. She told the jury flat out, he didn't understand them. If he wanted something, especially if it belonged to someone else, he struggled to grasp that he couldn't just use it without permission. That's telling to me. If something belonged to someone else, he struggled to grasp that he couldn't just use it without permission. Think about that. At the same time, she made a point to say she never saw him become physically aggressive. He would get frustrated, especially if rules weren't followed, but she never saw him lash out, and she was never concerned that he would.
Did he ever exhibit concrete thinking and taking things too literal?
Oh, yes.
Can you give me an example of that?
Well, if someone, if he were in a classroom and someone was playing a joke on him, number one, he couldn't interpret that as a joke if it was offensive to him. And instead of just dealing with that in a manner that would be accepted, he gets angry. His anger would be pretty bad at times.
Did you ever see him lash out at any other students?
I have never seen that.
Were you ever concerned that he might lash out at other students?
No, ma'am.
You had mentioned that when playing with students, other students, that he could get angry. Could you tell what the basis of the anger was? I mean, was it because anger to get anger? Was he frustrated? Was he annoyed? Could you tell the difference?
He basically he couldn't understand it. Just couldn't understand it.
When playing with other students, did you ever see him become frustrated with the process?
Yes.
Can you give the jury an example of one of those instances?
I can't remember the name of this game years ago. It was a card game. You collect the cards and then you play
Pokemon?
Might be that, for sure. When I had him with another student, they would play that. They couldn't wait. That was exciting to them. But if the other student did not follow the rules, and believe me, Tanner knew the rules. He just didn't understand all of them, but he could quote them to you. If the other student did not follow those rules, he couldn't take that. He just didn't understand that. No, you can't do that. I told you earlier, you can't do that. He needed the world to behave in the way he had learned the world was supposed to behave. No, that's not the world.
She described how much structure, though, didn't matter to Tanner. If something unexpected happened, he did not adjust easily. He needed preparation, routine, predictability. Sudden changes could throw him off completely. And so a lot of her work focused on teaching coping skills, like how to stop, think, respond instead of just reacting. And this is where her testimony started to go deeper into how Tanner processed the world. She explained the concept of consequences. She said that most people can anticipate what might happen if they do something wrong, and that anticipation helps guide behavior. But in Tanner's case, he doesn't foresee that. He just can't foresee that. She described how he had to actively learn to stop himself and think through a situation. What have I just done? And if I do this, what's going to happen? So like this causation, this happens, A happens, then B is the consequence. This did not come naturally to him. It was something he was still learning, still developing. At the same time, she didn't say he wasn't capable. In fact, she said he was getting there. He was improving, learning, and slowly making progress. She also gave the jury a look into his home life. As part of her job, she went into the home and met his family. When asked about his mother, her response was harsh. She was not a mother. She just wasn't a mother. Wow. Dang. She said Tanner was essentially put on the back burner and that his mother had her own issues. According to Beth, her presence in the home actually disrupted Tanner's routines and caused more instability, which is especially difficult for a child with autism who depends on consistency. So in contrast, though, she described his grandmother as a lovely lady who tried her best and was clearly someone who cared deeply about Tanner. His grandfather, on the other hand, she said, was more gruff, sometimes raising his voice, which would upset Tanner. Beth also talked about the work she did with Tanner outside of structured settings. She would take him on community outings, parks, restaurants, even her own home, to teach him how to behave in the real world and in real world situations. These sort of were these opportunities or controlled opportunities to practice social interaction, problem solve, cope with frustration. And she said he did improve. He learned things like lowering his voice, participating in conversations, adjusting his behavior depending on the setting. Despite all of this, she made something very clear when the defense asked the obvious question. They asked her directly if she believed Tanner's autism was the reason that this crime happened. And she said no. They asked if it was an excuse, a justification, a defense. And she said no, no, no. But then she added something really interesting. She said, I'll tell you where it comes in my mind, is that this young man should have never been in that truck by himself.
You understand that he has pled guilty to the offense of capital murder that involved a kidnapping.
Yes, I do.
And you understand that there have been other allegations involved with that kidnapping and murder of Athena.
I don't know that. I have not involved myself in anything.
Now, Beth, are you saying that Tanner's autism was, the reason why this incident occurred?
No.
Do you feel that it's an excuse for what happened?
No.
Do you feel that it justifies
No.
what he did?
No.
Do you feel that it's a defense to what he did?
It's what?
A defense to what he did?
No, I don't. I'll tell you where it comes in my mind, is this young man should have never been in that truck by himself.
So that line became a focal point during cross-examination. The prosecution highlighted the fact that Beth's interactions with Tanner over 20 years ago, but during that time, she said that he had shown the ability to improve, that he could learn right from wrong, and that he had manners, saying things like, yes, ma'am. He apologized when he did something wrong. The prosecution got her to agree that he could make correct decisions, even if it took effort. And then they zeroed in on her statement about the truck. One of the prosecutors reframed it, saying, okay, essentially, what you're saying is he shouldn't have been trusted to be in that truck alone. And she agreed, but clarified. She said, it wasn't that he couldn't do the job, but that when something unexpected happens, something outside his cognitive comfort zone, his instinct is to just fix it. And sometimes his fix is worse than the problem. They also challenged her assumptions about what actually happened in the crime, pointing out that if certain facts were different than what she believed, would that change her opinion? And she said, no, it didn't. Her opinion remained that he shouldn't have been alone. And again, they asked the key question, are you saying autism caused him to kidnap and murder a child? Her answer again was, no, I'm not saying that.
You said something earlier, and I want to ask you about it. You said that Tanner should have never been in that truck. Is that what you said?
That's exactly what I said.
And I guess I need to know.
Alone.
Okay. So I guess what you're saying is that he shouldn't have been trusted to be in that truck alone.
Right. And that's not to say that he couldn't do that job and do it well. That's to say, when circumstances don't follow the norm for him, cognitively, he can't, what he's telling himself is, just fix it. Let's just fix this. And sometimes his fix is worse than the problem.
Right. And what's your understanding of what he initially did to Athena Strand that precipitated this event? What's your understanding of that?
Well, from the news, back when we lost Athena, it's my understanding that he was backing the truck up and bumped her, or, I don't know, hit her with the truck some way.
Mm-hmm. And that's why you're saying that he shouldn't have been alone in the truck, because your understanding is that he hit her with the truck.
That's right. Think about it. If another adult had been in that vehicle with him, the outcome would have more than likely been very different, and we would still have little Athena.
You understand, if the fact is that he did not hit her with that truck, that creates a whole different situation.
He didn't?
If the evidence is that he did not hit her with that truck, and that did not happen as you understand it, that changes your opinion on things, doesn't it?
Well, it doesn't change my opinion, because my opinion will always be he should have had another adult in the car with him, in the vehicle with him. What it does, it makes me wonder what the whole thing was about. Why?
And you're not telling us today that his autism had anything to do with the criminal offense in this case?
With the outcome? You're going to have to ask that.
Yeah, I mean, are you saying that his autism caused him to kidnap and murder this child?
No. I'm saying it did not.
Up next, the defense called a neuroscientist to the stand, Dr. Jeffrey David Lewine. His testimony was about the brain, how it works, how it develops, and more importantly, what Tanner Horner's brain might look like compared to everyone else's. Dr. Lewine explained that the studies of the brain that he does, everything from individual brain cells to the larger networks that control memory, behavior, emotion, and decision-making. So he walks the jury through his background, which is extensive. He has degrees all the way through a doctorate in neuroscience, completed postdoctoral work, and now serves as the chief executive and chief scientific officer of a research center in New Mexico. He also mentioned that a significant portion of his work involves legal cases, but he made one thing very clear early on. He is not a medical doctor. He does not diagnose patients, prescribe treatment, or conduct physiological testing or psychological testing. His role is focusing on the science of treatment and using imaging tools to better understand how the brain is functioning. So to help the jury understand what he was about to show them, he started with the basics. He explained that the brain is made up of billions of neurons and trillions of connections, and that different parts of the brain control different things like emotion, memory, language, and behavior. And crucially, not all brains are the same. He said that brain development can be influenced by a lot of factors: genetics, environment, trauma, toxic exposure, stress, psychiatric conditions. It's not one size fits all. And then he used a surprisingly relatable example to drive that point home: the viral image known as the dress. Who remembers the dress?
So I don't know if any of you recognize this, and I don't know how well it's going to show here, but this is the infamous yellow and white dress that was on the internet. I look at that dress, and it is yellow and white to me. Both of my daughters, when they look at that dress, it's blue and black. And I don't know if anybody here is seeing blue and black, but about a third of people see this as blue and black. And my daughter's like, "Dad, you're crazy. That is white. That is blue and black." And I'm like, "No, it's not. It's white and gold." It has to do with the way that my brain wired itself to perceive color and the location of light sources. Much to my chagrin, the actual fibers in the dress are blue and black. I'm misperceiving it. But the point is that how you perceive the world, how you interact with the world, is a function of how your brain is developed. And if neurotypical people can have such widely different perceptions, imagine what happens when you put brain injury and dysfunction on top of that. So how you perceive the world, how you interact with the world, is a function of how your brain is wired and functioning.
Okay, so what factors influence how your brain develops and how it gets wired?
So again, there are all of these different factors that influence things. And so anytime we start to look at brain damage, we start to think about brain dysfunction, and we want to try and understand what the potential causes are, we need to look at all of these different factors.
So this was a simple way of telling the jury. Two people can look at the exact same thing and experience it differently because their brains are built differently. From there, he transitioned into Tanner specifically. He told the jury that based on Tanner's history, there were several potential factors that could have influenced his brain development, thinking like possible fetal alcohol syndrome, lead exposure, toxic stress environment during childhood, neurodevelopmental conditions like Asperger's or ADHD, and even possible head trauma. Now, he wasn't saying that any one of these definitively caused anything, but he was laying out a picture of multiple risk factors. And then came the actual brain scans. Dr. Lewine explained that he performed several types of imaging on Tanner's brain, an MRI, an EEG, and a PET scan. Starting with the MRI, which looks at brain structure, he told the jury that on the basic levels, doctors who reviewed the scan said everything looked within normal limits. There were no tumors, no major damage, nothing that would jump out clinically as a serious abnormality. But then he introduced something more nuanced called volumetric analysis. That's where you measure specific parts of the brain and compare them to averages. And this is where he said there was a difference. He told the jury that Tanner's left orbital frontal cortex was about 20% smaller than average, meaning roughly 50 million fewer neurons in that area. And he explained why this should matter. He said that this cortex is a key region involved in emotional regulation and social behavior, basically how you control your actions and understand other people. He said it is one of these key brain regions involved in the emotional regulation of behavior and social cognition, and added that abnormalities in this area are often seen in autism spectrum disorders, but can also be linked to things like traumatic brain injury or depression. Then he moved into white matter, the connections between brain regions using something called diffusion tensor imaging. Most of Tanner's connections looked normal, but there was one area, the fornix, that stood out. That's a part of the brain involved in short-term memory. So Tanner's measurements there were in the lowest 5th percentile, not 0. They were functioning, but they were definitely lower than most people. Next came the EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain. And here, his language it was a little bit more interesting. He said Tanner had significant increased theta activity all the way through delta and high beta activity over the left hemisphere. Then he translated that into something a little bit more understandable. His baseline brain activity was not typical. He said they show significant abnormalities. Take a listen.
Let me just show you a typical control subject. So even a control subject, because you're making lots and lots of measurements, may have a couple of scattered abnormalities. Okay? That's common. It's known as the problem of multiple comparisons. You can get some false positive things. We have statistical methods for dealing with that. So here's just an example of a control subject. Here's what we actually find for Tanner. So Tanner has very significant increased theta activity all the way through delta and high beta activity over the left hemisphere of his brain. He's got some minor disruptions in coherence. They're actually not that bad. But his baseline brain rhythms are not neurotypical. They show significant abnormalities. One of the other analyses that we can do is to actually figure out where in the brain things are coming from. And again, this is all done by a computer using FDA-cleared software. This is looking at how abnormal the currents are and where those abnormalities are coming from. This is a generic brain, so the underlying brain is not Tanner, it's just for demonstrative. But the colors and the locations of the abnormalities come from the data from Tanner. And he shows in particular abnormal theta activity and abnormal high beta activity over the left hemisphere, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, a little bit of the frontal lobe.
And what can we learn from that?
So what these data are indicating are, so that the theta is indicating that there's some general brain dysfunction. Increased theta activity is often associated with traumatic brain injury, but you can also see it in other psychiatric conditions. High beta activity is very consistent with an autism spectrum disorder. Now, you cannot, and I can't look at the EEG in isolation and say, aha, this is autism, okay? These are not diagnostic techniques in that sense. They are supplemental information. These are patterns that are consistent with the presence of the autism spectrum disorder that has been diagnosed by people other than myself.
So you're looking at the brain. We know the brain controls behaviors and gives you information on other psychiatric or developmental disorders that you're not diagnosing solely based on this.
That is correct.
Finally, he showed the jury the last scan images, which measure how active different parts of the brain are. He used color-coded visuals, blue for underactive activities and areas, red for overactive ones, and explained that Tanner's brain showed both. He pointed out underactivity in areas like the orbital frontal cortex and parts of the temporal lobe, and overactivity in another region called the cuneus, which he said is involved in things like social cognition, empathy, and understanding what other people are thinking. And the takeaway he kept coming back to was this. Tanner's brain showed both structural and functional differences in areas tied to emotional regulation, memory, and social understanding. According to Dr. Lewine, the overall pattern was consistent with autism spectrum disorder, potentially influenced by other factors like trauma or toxic exposure. At one point, he made a statement that probably caught the jury's attention. He said that while it's normal for people to have one or two minor abnormalities, the number of differences seen in Tanner's brain would be found in less than 0.01% of the population. That's an incredibly small percentage, and clearly something the defense wants to emphasize. But, and this is important, he placed limits on what all of this actually means. He told the jury very directly, from the imaging alone, I cannot say anything specific about Mr. Horner's behavioral pattern. In other words, these scans can only show differences. They cannot tell you why someone did something. And that's exactly where the prosecution focused during cross-examination. They started by reminding the jury of his limitations. He's not a medical doctor. He can't diagnose autism. He can't perform psychological testing. And importantly, the doctor who initially read Tanner's MRI scan found no major abnormalities. They were considered clinically normal. They also dug into that finding about the fornix, asking whether those lower values would affect something like long-term memory or a person's ability to understand that certain actions like kidnapping or killing are wrong, or doing that to a child. And Dr. Lewine said clearly, no, it would not. Then they push even further into the core issue. Can these brain scans tell you whether someone could not control their actions versus simply choosing not to? His answer, no. He said he cannot distinguish between a lack of control and an exercise of free will based on imaging alone. They also got him to agree that having brain abnormalities does not automatically mean someone will commit a crime, and that many people with brain injuries or neurological differences still function normally. And finally, they circled back to the ultimate question. Are you saying autism or these brain differences caused this crime? Take a listen.
So even with any abnormality and even with some deficits, you're not telling us that a person is going to act a certain way?
Again, I can only talk about the general, this is what it's correlated with. From the imaging alone, I cannot say anything specific about Mr. Horner's behavioral pattern.
I'm talking about anyone. You can't say any person will act a certain way?
Not explicitly, that is correct.
You can't say whether or not they'll commit crimes?
Correct.
And you can't say whether or not they'll engage in any particular conduct?
Correct.
So with this witness, the defense is trying to show the jury that Tanner's brain is not typical, that there are measurable scientific differences in the areas that control behavior, decision-making, and social understanding. They're building this idea that his brain may process the world differently. But at the same time, the prosecution made sure the jury did not walk away thinking this was a scientific explanation for the crime itself, a horrific, horrific crime. Because even the expert after all the scans, all the data, ultimately admitted that he cannot connect those brain differences directly to Tanner's actions. Up next, another expert took the stand, Dr. Erin David Bigler, a neuropsychologist with a long and very accomplished career. His testimony was about teaching the jury how the brain works so they could better understand the testimony they had just heard from the previous neuroscientist. Dr. Bigler introduced himself as a professor emeritus of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University. He explained that he's a licensed, board-certified clinical neuropsychologist, a cognitive neuroscientist, a researcher, and honestly, his resume went on for quite a while. He talked about building brain imaging labs, publishing hundreds of scientific articles, writing textbooks, and lecturing all over the country. So, very credible. But he made clear that he never examined Tanner Horner. He wasn't there to diagnose him, evaluate him, or give an opinion about what Tanner was thinking at the time of his crime. And by the way, I find it fascinating that all of the defense witnesses, all of their expert witnesses, not one of them actually evaluated Tanner. Anyway, I'll keep going. Another one who's very, very, very accomplished hasn't evaluated Tanner. But as he put it, his role was to educate the jury specifically about brain anatomy, how the brain functions, and how scientists study it using modern tools. He told the jury that in his lab, they had a saying, every behavior has an anatomy. In other words, everything we do, every action, every reaction starts in the brain. Behavior isn't random. It comes from how different parts of the brain process information and interact with each other. And from there, he walked them through the basics of brain structure, explaining the different lobes, the frontal lobes, temporal lobes, and so on. And then he switched to something a little bit more visual and relatable. He used an analogy that made the whole concept easier to picture. He said to think of the brain like a system of highways. He talked about driving on I-35 when he was working in Texas, heading toward Dallas, and how once you get near a major city, all these highways and intersections start connecting, right? He scolded, that's a hub, that you can go anywhere in the United States once you get on one of those hubs. And then he tied it back to the brain, saying, the brain is exactly the same way. Everything is interconnected. He explained that the brain works through networks, different regions and connected by pathways. It's an information back and forth. And each one of those networks is responsible for a different aspect of behavior. So when something is off in one part of the network, it can affect how the entire system works. He then brought the jury back to some of the specific brain areas that had already been mentioned by the previous expert, especially the orbitofrontal cortex. He pointed out that this area sits right above the eye sockets and is part of the frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and regulating behavior. But he said what really mattered was how the area connects to other parts of the brain, right? Particularly the temporal lobe and the limbic system. He explained that it plays a huge role in regulating emotions, things like emotional tone, reactions, and feelings. And then he contrasted that with another part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which he described as the slower, more contemplative decision-making area. This is the part of the brain that helps you pause and think things through and make rational choices. He said something that really ties into the defense's overall theme. He explained that if there is an imbalance between these systems, if the emotional part of the brain is overpowering the more thoughtful decision-making part, then emotions can override contemplative behavior. In other words, feelings can take over logic. He connected that directly to the idea of social cognition, how we understand other people, interpret situations, and regulate our own behavior in response. And because of all of that, he said, it sort of depends on this balance between emotion and reasoning. From there, he moved into how scientists actually study the brain, building on what the jury had already heard. He explained different types of imaging, each tell you something different. MRI shows you the structure, what the brain physically looks like. EEG shows you how the brain is functioning electrically, right? And he said the key is putting all these scans together. Looking at one scan alone only tells you part of the story, but when you combine them, you can start to make more informed interpretations about how the brain is functioning as a whole. He also mentioned concepts like coherence, explaining that when different parts of the brain are working together properly, their activity patterns line up in a certain way. And when they don't, it can suggest problems with connectivity. But even as he explained all of this, he stayed in that educational lane. He wasn't pointing to Tanner and saying, this is what happened. He was giving the jury the tools to understand how something could happen in general terms. But during cross-examination, the prosecution brought it back to the basics, asking, did you examine Tanner? No, he didn't. You're not offering a diagnosis. Correct. You're not here to say whether he knew right from wrong. Correct. You're not saying autism causes crime. Correct.
You did not do an evaluation on Tanner Horner, the defendant in this case, correct?
No, I did not see him, evaluate him, or anything else.
Have you ever met Tanner Horner?
No.
So you're here today just to testify, I guess, in general or educational reasons?
Correct.
Okay. And you're not testifying that Tanner Horner didn't know right from wrong, are you?
I am not.
And you're not saying that autism caused this crime? Doctor?
No, we heard you.
Did you hear the question?
Oh, right from wrong?
No, I'm sorry. The question was, you're not saying that autism was the cause of the crime in this case?
No.
They also touched on the fact that he's being paid for his testimony around $4,000 plus additional fees, which is something juries are always allowed to consider when weighing credibility. So really, his testimony was to reinforce what the previous expert said. This idea that the brain is a complex network, that behavior comes from how that network functions, and that if something is off in those connections, it can affect how a person processes emotions, makes decisions, and interacts with the world. But at the same time, the prosecution made sure the jury understood the limits of that testimony. Because no matter how detailed the science gets, Dr. Bigler never said and could not say what Tanner Horner was thinking, whether he could control his actions, whether any of this actually caused the crime. And that's the pattern that I'm starting to see with all of these defense expert witnesses. So like the defense, first off, I'm surprised at how many expert witnesses the defense is bringing in. I've actually really been surprised this week. And the defense is just like putting one expert witness after another, just kind of layering science, right? Like to shape how the jury thinks about Tanner's brain and behavior. But so far, even their own experts are stopping short of tying those differences directly to what happened or even tying them to Tanner, because none of them are assessing Tanner. They're just talking about their education and what they've learned about brains or psychology or risk factors. And you know what else either? None of them are talking about Zero. Remember Zero? Remember Tanner's alt personality when all of a sudden he realized he might get in trouble? I'm just going to point this out. And I don't know, I'm going to have to ask Dr. John Matthias, my co-host. He is a criminal psychologist. He assesses risk. He's not an expert witness on this case. But we're going to talk about this because I have a lot of questions. But isn't Zero, in my opinion, because nobody's bringing Zero up. Nobody's saying Zero is real. Nobody is saying this is a thing. And all the evidence we've seen from the defense witnesses about his childhood, no one's talking about this invisible friend or this other personality or this different persona that he had. Not one of them so far. And wouldn't then Zero be a way for Tanner to get rid of consequences that he knew would come from what he did? John and I are going to talk about this in another hour because I really want to break down the last weeks of Tanner's trial. At the center of this is a little girl named Athena Strand. And no matter what defense experts say, none of them have been able to say yet that any of the science that they talk about causes someone to hurt, assault, kidnap, and murder a little girl. And not one of them has talked about this alt personality, Zero. No one from his childhood, no scientist. So I definitely have questions for Dr. John Mathias, a clinical and forensic psychologist. So hit subscribe, hit notifications, because that episode is coming. And when it comes to this case, I know that when it comes to the defense, all we're hearing about is Tanner Horner. So I want to bring it back to Athena, because she is the center of this, and that little girl deserves to be alive and would be alive if it wasn't for Tanner Horner.